Yesterday, I recorded a video here on my GoPro where it was basically a follow-up talking about how you could use your PS5 or any device, whether it's the Xbox Series game consoles or maybe even to an extent PS4 Pro and Xbox One, whatever the case is, or even Blu-ray devices, if you will, 4K UHD Blu-ray devices that enable you to have HDR on them the moment you turn them on. In other words, they're detected as HDR, high dynamic range devices. And that's true. That is indeed true. And that video yesterday, like I said, was a follow-up to an audio that I did basically a couple of days ago where I talked about the fact that when you put a DVD, a 480p to 720p DVD, if not a little higher, in your 4K UHD Blu-ray player, that you're going to get a signal of 4K UHD, basically the 3840 by 2160. Excuse me. And it'll basically make your picture look a lot cleaner. In other words, basically the up conversion, thanks to the signal being sent between the player and the TV, the up conversion will make you feel like it just came out today. Well, as I originally said in yesterday's video that I originally recorded here, but didn't get to post because, well, I didn't have time. I took a little nap and pretty much I wanted to do some other videos, but my mom came home and you know how that is. But anyway, in that video I talked about that with the HDR, the HDR enabled devices, that you'd be able to also watch your DVDs and Blu-rays, not just in 4K, but also in high dynamic range. Well, I tested that theory out again today on my PS5 just moments ago before recording this, and apparently the PS5 does not detect the DVDs, as HDR. Even though when I go back to the main menu, it detects the main menu as HDR. And even when I go to YouTube and VUDU, that's VUDU, it detects those, still under the HDR, I guess you could say, recognition. And when you go and use the dynamic portion of the picture options, like with any TV, you get the picture options of standard, default, natural, sports, cinematic, movie, or dynamic, or whatever they call it otherwise outside of that, HDR, or high dynamic, or cinematic dynamic, who knows? When you go to that option, a majority of people that have a 4K television that have, that picture option will go to dynamic range. They will go to the dynamic picture option because it'll give them the closest feel to something being in HDR. It will. Well, to get to my point here, basically I checked it out again just to test out the theory, and like I said, the HDR picture, or the HDR, the three letters HDR that come up when you put in an HDR 4K Blu-ray game, or you turn on a HDR enabled device like a PS5, those letters in the picture area, that are under the, that are always there when you either go to standard, to natural, to movie, or dynamic, those letters HDR disappeared. But from what I could tell, the DVD still felt like, it was being seen in high dynamic range, even though it wasn't being recognized as a high dynamic range, I guess you could say, device or disc in this case. And I think the reason for that is due to the fact that the device that I put it in is a high dynamic range device. And that the only reason the HDR letters, disappeared is because it's not registering it, like I said, or acknowledging it as a HDR disc that has that high dynamic range on there to make the picture look a little bit more vibrant. And that's unfortunate, but like I said, the weird thing is it still feels like you're watching it in high dynamic range. It really does. And I checked all the settings. I checked whether or not HDR was on. It is. Here's the thing. I always keep it on because I don't play my system that much. So I'm not worried about that. But yeah, the HDR was on the always on option. It was basically being shown the entire device being signaled and acknowledged as a being in 2160p 3840 by 2160p at 60 frames. So everything was connected correctly, being registered correctly. But again, I think the catch is essentially when I put my disc in there, basically, the little nougat, if you will, the little I don't think it's not a deal breaker in my opinion, but the little nougat, if you will, of basically it not being registered or acknowledged as something in HDR, even though it's being played off an HDR capable device. That can be a little, like I said, a little annoying, but it doesn't. But it doesn't feel like I said. It doesn't feel like it's not being registered as HDR. I know it sounds convoluted in what I'm saying, but what I'm trying to point out is it basically, even though it won't register it as an HDR enabled disc, it still feels like it's being shown in HDR. That if you catch what I'm saying, it kind of feels like it's still being shown in HDR. And like I said, I think the reasoning for that is because I'm playing it off an HDR enabled device. Because anytime I go back to the menu, it automatically registers and is acknowledged as HDR. You go to the picture mode and it will have the three letters HDR next to the picture mode that it's currently set in. So to me, I think the only reason those three letters HDR disappear is because the disc is not registered as HDR enabled, but the reason it still has that feeling, that atmosphere, that vibe to it, that it's still being seen that way, is because it's being played off an HDR enabled device. That's what it feels like, in my opinion. Now, I'm sure I'm not the only one that's noticed that has a PS5, maybe an Xbox Series X or S, maybe to an extent PS4 Pro and Xbox One, or whatever the case may be, or even an HDR-enabled Blu-ray, 4K UHD Blu-ray device. I'm sure I'm not the only one that notices that. I'm sure I'm not the only one that notices that, but also sees that, yeah, even though it's not, even though my DVD or the DVD you put in is not being registered in that manner, it's still being showcased like it is. Like the picture quality is high dynamic range picture quality, along with the 4K quality you will always get. So it still has that feeling, still has that vibration and, visualness to it that kind of, in my opinion, makes that little, I guess you could say, that little nougat, less of an annoyance, than it is, because it's still being shown in high dynamic range. It's just that the disc is not being registered as much. If you kind of see what I'm saying, and it's weird because when you go, like I said, when you go to YouTube and VUDU, those streaming sites, if you will, even the videos that are not recorded in high dynamic range, or the movies that have not filmed in high dynamic range, you can still watch in high HDR because it's still registering the whole thing in HDR. So it's kind of weird. It's kind of convoluted. But anyway, I just wanted to mention that, talk about